This is Lecture 123A, Building Socialism, Part 1, that accompanies forthcoming Volume 7 on Communism in Europe. USSR to NEP, the 5-year plans. In 1926, things were going very well for the Bolshevik regime in the USSR and for Bolshevism in China too. The world's capitalist classes, on the other hand, were very uneasy. Bolshevik success in achieving social justice for the masses of previously downtrodden people was having repercussions in their countries. Those big ruling capitalist families in Europe knew Bolshevik success was being responsible for these increasing difficulties with their own working people. The workers were demanding national health care and unemployment insurance. If the Russians could do it, given all they had suffered in the World War and the Revolution and the Civil War, then the rulers of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany should be able to concede some social welfare as well. In short, we Bolsheviks got the credit from the masses and the blame from the rulers. Of course, the big bourgeoisie were right as far as breads went. What they would not admit was that capitalism itself had brought them to this, and the international big business class, especially in Europe, concluded the USSR had to be destroyed. They stepped up their aggression. Now, our number one enemy in Europe was the United Kingdom. Britain would remain our primary problem in Europe even after Hitler took over in Germany. Why? Because Baldwin, the Prime Minister, persisted in his anti-Soviet plotting. The only roadblock Baldwin recognized was Hitler's poor white trash status. Hitler rekindled in him his worst thoughts about Cromwell, at least until the communists rescued the Republic in Spain in 1937, and by the end of that year, Baldwin acquiesced in the idea of Hitler leading his anti-Bolshevik crusade. Then Hitler attacked the USSR on June 22, 1941. At any rate, we will get to that. Our ambassador to England from September 1923 until June of 1926 was the magician of Rapallo, Christian Rakovsky. The Rapallo Pact of April 1922 we have already discussed extensively. In 1926, Rakovsky published a telling theoretical paper about then contemporary British capitalism entitled The Decline of the World Shop in Communist International, on his way out the door of our London embassy. And his main points in that article were: 1. The ongoing economic crisis in Great Britain were structural and irreversible. I have reviewed this for you in previous chapters and lectures. And secondly, he found this true across the board in British manufacturing industries, and particularly acute in the mining and textile industries. The ruling Brit oligarchy and the class behind them could, 3, find no way out of the coming class struggles, and were desperate to stop communist news and influence from reaching British workers. He predicted they would, 4, do everything to break formal relations with the Soviet Union, and 5, work in every conceivable way to subvert the communist government in Russia, including organizing subversion and war. We have 15 years until the capitalist attack. Shortly after the publication of The Decline of the World Shop, the Brits did exactly those things predicted by Rakovsky. These cap regimes began a determined campaign under Baldwin and Chamberlain to create a London-Berlin-Rome axis, their idea being Germany would take the lead in a holy war against Bolshevism. The Brits kicked it off when British banks pulled their loans to Russia, although the Bolsheviks had the best credit rating in the world, next to that of the USA. And the Japanese capitalists made a secret deal with the Chinese mobster Chiang Kai-shek, who was the nominal, and he hoped soon actual, commander of the KMT Party's National Revolutionary Army. What kind of deal? A continuation on a national scale of what the Green Gang had been doing for them in Shanghai. That is, providing cheap labor for Japanese maquiladoras and safe packaging of opium destined for Western Hemisphere ports on Japanese ships. Accordingly, the Green Gang saw bright prospects for a prosperous tomorrow, if the threat of Bolshevism in China could be negated. The Green Gang-Japan secret illegal trade relationship included a quid pro quo. The Japanese capitalist regime secretly promised military support for the upcoming ambush of the communists in Shanghai. This was the surprise that China and Chang and Big-eared Du were planning for Shanghai for 1927. The Japanese capitalists were often craftier than their European counterparts, who were openly hostile to the Soviet government, although they viciously suppressed Japanese communism, playing down at this point state-to-state hostility. In China, the capitalist half of the alliance with the Reds was predominant inside the KMT. This was true, although the communists operated as full members. Unknown to Lenin's James Bond troubleshooter Michael Borodin, the Green Gang had begun its planning for a massacre of the communist part of the Northern Expedition. The way in which Borodin operationalized Lenin's idea of a joint cross-class alliance to establish true bourgeois capitalism in China depended for its success on sincere bourgeois leadership such as Sun Yat-sen had seemed to offer. However, Sun began dying in December 1924, and his leadership mantle had been usurped by that group of bourgeoisie least likely to be amenable to Lenin's idea for a bourgeois democracy for China. But Borodin didn't know that, nor did the Russian Politburo. What Lenin wanted for China in 1922 was a U.S. type of bourgeois democracy, and by this he meant China should be independent of foreign domination, as the U.S. had been after military victory over British colonialism in 1781. This, in short, is what Lenin and the Bolsheviks had been shooting for China. When the Joffe deal was made with Sun in January 1923, it seemed as if this was quite feasible. And to repeat what I have already reported, it was China's extreme backwardness which made all this logically necessary if we were to gain a safe and secure buffer for Soviet socialism in the Far East. In other words, in the Russian Bolshevik Politburo's view from 1922 forward, China was in far too primitive a condition, both technologically and socially, to jump into socialism. China would be far more likely to succeed along a bourgeois democratic path, and the security of world socialism, that is the USSR, would be far better served with a stable and healthy and friendly capitalist regime in Peking, or Beijing, than an anti-dice shoot for proletarian dictatorship. A Chinese proletarian government would at best end up as it had in Russia, with a tiny working class and its party sitting on a nation of illiterate, ignorant peasants. By 1927, the Bolsheviks in Russia began to remember that war with the capitalist countries was inevitable, and that the way things were going, they would be unprepared. NEP was doing well as far as relative prosperity was concerned, but the rate of industrialization was pitifully slow. Without capitalist bank credits for foreign entrepreneurs willing and able to build factories in Russia and the other republics, industrialization would be even slower. Furthermore, the necessary funding for the Red Army and its supporting military-industrial complex was woefully inadequate. Soviet survival depended on fully modernizing both. Some new source of revenue would have to be found if industrialization of the type necessary was to occur. Also, the Chika's economic directorate had been so successful at lifting foreign technology that factories and machines were piling up everywhere, because the infrastructure into which they were to be inserted lagged far behind need. Finally, without a secure eastern frontier, given the failure of the China policy in April 1927, the military danger of encirclement by the advanced capitalist countries would be twice as great. General Secretary Stalin had a solution in mind. He began putting it into effect in the second half of 1927 and speeded it up in the early months of 1928, so that by August of that year he was ready to go for broke. Our own crisis was at hand if hidden. As far as the outside world was concerned, our Soviet success was a matter of fact. In the capitalist countries, it was assumed that much the same reconstruction was happening in Russia as had happened in their own countries after the First World War. As far as the big capitalist families of Western Europe were concerned, the only difference was that the caps would have appropriated the surplus value as profit in a capitalist system. As far as they were concerned, Russian communists were buying the support of their workers and farmers by their injudicious use of government funds. As far as industrial progress was concerned, our enemies could not have been more wrong. We had serious problems at every level within the national economy. Fortunately for us, the capitalists had no knowledge of our problems. We had destroyed the intelligence networks the Caps had originally put into place with the Boca Roach Motel. You should take note that having a base area in a backward country, for example Colombia, where we established social justice, is not the same thing as building stages of socialism and the stage of communism in a country. Our tasks with state power in our hands in the Soviet Union were far more sophisticated. However, scarcity, not the plenty Marx and Engels had required, underlay everything. Economic crisis flows from the anti-socialist fact of inheriting an insufficient capitalist mode of production. All Bolsheviks were convinced by the end of the Civil War the USSR's modernized industrialization had to be achieved if the party had any hope of staying in power and leading humanity into the world communist stage. It is elementary Marxist theory that one cannot build socialism, let alone communism, without the advanced industrial base of capitalism. Achieving fully mechanized agriculture and the concomitant necessary industrialization under capitalism is the rationale in our general theory of historical materialism for the entire socio-cultural evolutionary capitalist stage to begin with. It is precisely for this reason that Marxist historians have always pointed out that capitalism was progressive in its time. No longer is this true, as capitalism globally has entered its final phase of imperialism. That is the shipping of constant capital, machinery and factories, abroad to cheap labor centers. Now, capitalism controlled under the dictatorship of the proletariat was a different thing for the Soviet Union under NEP, as it is a totally different thing under the Chinese Communist Party. It is this capitalist stage preparation which makes the slogan, "From each according to her ability to each according to her needs," a practical political possibility. In other words, Marxists and Leninists knew that no amount of moral or ideological incentives could make up for the servitude epic reality of selfishness and sadism imposed on the masses. A primitive economy of scarcity was what we had in the middle 1920s. The question was not whether to build the necessary infrastructure. It was how do we build what we ideally should have inherited, and how long will it take? In 1928, the Soviets had no choice but to follow Stalin's solution. NEP could have succeeded had the USSR not faced unremitting imperialist encirclement, strangulation, and sabotage. The Caps were determined to liquidate us and were preparing for one more world war. It was to be an all-out assault against the USSR. This implacable belligerence necessitated Stalin's 5-year plan with its first economy emphasis. Why? Because capitalist families attacked us in a because worldwide class war would continue. It was only a matter of time until the biggest capitalist families attacked us in a second world war. We had, as Lenin pointed out, a little time, but not too much, to get ready for this global assault against the USSR. This was a necessary matter of fact and not a theoretical possibility, but a theoretical certainty. The only hypotheticals were those surrounding this inevitable conflict, such as how many, if not all, of the major capitalist countries will attack simultaneously. Can we avoid a two-front war in Eurasia? How much time do we have? How can we get the minimum industrial mode of production we should have inherited on our own? And how long will this minimum industrial preparation take to put into place? Now, every time we turned around, we found ourselves stymied by lack of capital. This fact of needed constant and financial capital, that is machinery, factories, and money, being in critical short supply, resulted in a long series of production nightmares. The best recent summary and exposition of the consequences of this scarcity you can read in Hammer and Rifle by David R. Stone, published in 2000 by University Press of Kansas in Lawrence, 287 pages long. In 1923, as the post-Civil War period began to unfold, the party began to create a series of government bureaus, for example, Gosplan, the State Planning Commission, to undertake the planning that a socialist economy should feature. In these years, 1923 to 1928, the central antagonistic contradictions within the primitive inherited capitalist economy became acute and demanded resolution. One of these government institutions was the State Planning Commission, or Gosplan. Another was NEC, the Supreme National Economic Council, Vasenka. Another, the Federal Council of Labor and Defense, STO, and its headquarters executive body, RZ, and the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate, RABKRN. In addition, the state, that is the Army, Navy, and Police, had its institutional planning bodies to ensure that military needs were adequately taken into planning consideration. In particular, these were the War Planning and Mobilization Directorate, MPU, of the foregoing STO, and the Revnsovet, the Revolutionary Supreme Command Council, 1918-1934, which was the military's main planning input authority. There were emerging central irreconcilable contradictions within the primitive socialist economy. Two examples among the hundreds of monumental undertakings envisioned in the first 5-year plan illustrate them. First of all, the first at the automobile truck factory in the old city of Nizhny Novgorod, renamed Gorky, and secondly, at the newly created city of Magnetic Mountain, or Magnitogorsk. Scarcity and the problem of bourgeois specialists. A. Cheating. Scarcity underlay everything. It made funding and the supply of needed, essential machinery and parts an ongoing problematic matter. Managers often hid excess production capability, whether in the form of labor power or raw materials and machinery, as a buffer against failure due to lack of materiel and or workers, and B. limited employment opportunities. There were only so many jobs to go around within the government, or for that matter in the party and the state. Bourgeois specialists were essential to the construction of Soviet industry. The immediately resulting problem was that these bourgeois specialists took too many of the jobs that should have gone to party members. The very men and women who had fought and died for the present system were not being rewarded. This was a structural antagonism and could only be resolved by creating more jobs, thereby replacing the bourgeois specialists as time passed and as soon as possible. A struggle between old Bolshevik would-be managers and the bourgeois specialists unfolded. It had begun at the very beginning of government planning. In other words, it was exactly the same kind of split occurring in the new industrial managerial class that had occurred earlier in the officer class of the Red Army. Scarcity and wrecking. C. Wrecking. On the one hand, failure to meet quotas or make production deadlines was taken by upper management and the higher authorities very badly. In the atmosphere of personal dislike and hatred existing among old Bolsheviks and bourgeois specialists, it was a simple enough thing to jump to the conclusion that these failures were purposeful rather than what they mainly were, namely inherent bureaucratic problems in such a primitive productive economy. Simultaneously, it was also true that the bourgeois specialists did not like the Soviet government or the Soviet system. The Cheka was constantly being informed that these specialists in their private lives were critical of the regime and that they often whispered hopes that it would be short-lived. And finally, shock labor, proletarian enthusiasm. On the other hand, throwing shock labor at problems could break production bottlenecks, and it went a long way toward proving that the slackers in fulfilling quotas, making deadlines, and their innovation failures were wrecking socialist construction on purpose. Stalin's and fellow theoreticians' concerns was not with those who were actually wrecking, but with the social contradiction between these two classes. Bourgeois specialists versus old Bolsheviks in production meant that the bourgeois specialists were predisposed to be an endemic ideological enemy. E. Our secret weapon. But because of this factor of morally, spiritually decisive working-class shock labor, a decisive breakthrough in production had been accomplished. Our party used the one thing we had which our enemies did not, and that was the spiritual superiority of a mass of producers working for the social good. At bottom, our success was due to this idea of workers engaging in self-sacrifice of material comforts today for the achievement tomorrow of a true proletarian society. That society being one where each person lives in equality, justice, and material well-being of all. That is, in a world of plenty where all the necessities of life for everyone are easily produced, in which people receive according to their needs and nothing more. Our international enemies recognized this. They had embarked on a policy of genocidal war against the Soviet people. As they saw it, this was their last chance to reverse the course of history. It was the first of many such attempts to strangle socialism in the cradle that continues to the present day against Cuba and Venezuela. Trotsky's end. In January 1924, Trotsky began losing his fight with Stalin the minute Lenin died. Trotsky had alienated the Bolshevik Old Guard, and without Lenin's protection, it was only a matter of time. The man leading the Old Guard was Joseph Stalin. However, if it had not been him, it would have been someone else of the Old Guard type who disliked and confronted Trotsky. The result would have been the same. Anyway, Stalin had gathered the reins of state and governmental power in his hands, and he knew how to use them. Trotsky had become a legend, mainly in his own mind, irrelevant compared to the great real-world crises the party confronted at home and abroad. His idea of whipping up international revolution was already party policy. It was being conducted daily through the party's secret department and through the Comintern in its open as well as secret departments. What could be done was being done, and that was that. Lenin had said in his last testament that the party would have to choose between Trotsky and Stalin, and it had chosen Stalin, and that was the end of that story. By the way of background, we have seen that Trotsky and Stalin hated each other and had for many years. Mainly this was a personality clash that arose because of the polar opposite class backgrounds of these two men. Stalin came from a struggling family headed by an abusive man. He had had to fight for an education, which meant the seminary. Trotsky, on the other hand, came from a very wealthy family that would have been part of the major nobility if they had not been Jewish. Trotsky had been born with a silver spoon in his mouth and had every advantage that money could buy. Stalin hated the bourgeoisie, especially those in his party, and Trotsky was the archetype of bourgeois privilege. In 1907, Trotsky and Stalin had been the principals in the party debate about bank robbing as a source of funds. Stalin's hatred of Trotsky was more than political. He found himself up against the exact type of person he hated the most. That is, the kind of person who had had all the advantages that money could buy and was still claiming to be in the party of labor. Trotsky was a very obtuse person, Stalin thought, who failed to understand Stalin's sacrifice and dedication. Trotsky's every public utterance on Stalin drips with contempt. The worst part is everyone could clearly see that Trotsky's contempt for Stalin is the contempt of the new rich bourgeois for the poor self-educated worker, or God forbid, the farming serf that is getting a little too uppity. Everyone but Trotsky can see this master class attitude on his part, since most of the party members are self-educated workers, soldiers, sailors, and farmers. Trotsky's public disdain for Stalin's mannerisms, singing funeral dirges at weddings, and vice versa, and Stalin's hobbies of hunting, fishing, and mountain climbing were projections onto them of the same kind of disdain, and they resented it. It was bad enough for the bourgeois intellectuals to act that way without having to put up with it in the party and army. I think Stalin encouraged this mistake on the part of Trotsky. Why? Because he knew Trotsky's childish and derogatory commentary was alienating men and women who he would have to have at every level within the party if he had any chance at all about voting the boss. And because Stalin knew they were letting their class backgrounds and prejudices mislead them as to his intellectual acumen. The childish commentary on Stalin's hobbies speaks for itself. As the year progressed, we have learned so much more about Stalin and the clear Marxist content of his written works, and he was anything but shallow. He had been careful about letting the outside world know this, as he wanted the enemy to underestimate his intellect, and Trotsky played into this. In reality, Stalin's propensity was to read one new book every day. On the other hand, the party knew that their leader was a very intelligent and well self-educated man. Stalin conducted studies of specialized topics on a regular basis. Stalin's daily reading certainly made him the equivalent of any other Politburo leader, past, present, or future, in terms of PhD level intellectual preparation. He had the equivalent of multiple PhDs, learning from Krassen's lectures on petroleum geology and engineering to nuclear physics under Beria's informed tutelage. Along these lines, we see Stalin intervening intelligently in many technical scientific disputes, ranging from genetics to anthropological linguistics. For example, in genetics, the Lysenko versus Vavilov debate, and in linguistics, the N.Y.Marr debates with Stalin himself. Given all of this complimentary talk about the boss, how about the case of genetics, where we know Stalin was wrong? As has been reported by the late Harvard historian of science Stephen Jay Gould in Natural History magazine, Stalin was wrong for good reasons, or at least quite understandable and legitimate at the time scientific reasons. In the case of language, culture, and personality, anthropological linguistics, in other words, Stalin was right and set things straight in rather short order. For example, the debate between Stalin and N.Y.Marr. The point being, Stalin did not brag about intellectual accomplishments, or even refer to them often in his public discussions, although an intelligent, perceptive observer would have noticed that when Stalin did speak on such matters, he was completely informed. Stalin had lived and worked inside the empire of the Russias his entire life, except for a few trips abroad to see Lenin and participate in party meetings. He had gone to prison 7 times and survived, not to mention having escaped each time. He had gone, if nothing else, it shows that Stalin knew the real world and was capable. He always did, accepting their autumn 1920 Polish campaign differences, what Lenin wanted him to do until 1923, when the two men split over the way Stalin handled a bunch of assholes in Georgia. Now, about this latter incident, Stalin was correct in my opinion, but it was this incident that decidedly marked the end of his long and special relationship with Lenin. Stalin was the man Lenin had initially termed that wonderful Georgian, the man Lenin had relied upon perhaps more than any other to do all those things that he knew had to be done, and for so many years. Stalin was emotionally attached to Lenin, and never, even to himself apparently, allowed the thought that anything other than Lenin's ill health had been responsible for their untimely rupture. And Lenin was out of touch with reality by this time. He had had several strokes. It was just a matter of time until he died, and he had always been quite naive about the underlying template of human behavior. On January 21st, 1924, Lenin did die. In January 1925, 1 year after Lenin's January 1924 death, Trotsky was removed as war commissar, allowed to resign, where he had been outvoted 4-1 anyway since 1918. The removal had been predictable after the new army leadership was formalized at this Congress. However, the fact was that Trotsky had lost out as the sole decision-maker in March of 1921, and even before that, in November 1918, Trotsky had lost out as sole military commander. That was when Stalin and Lenin, as well as himself, were each made one of the 3 principal military leaders of the Soviet Republic, now declared a military camp. At any rate, in 1921, the victorious Leninists had brought Frunze in as the de facto new Army Chief of Staff, with Voroshilov his adjutant. Now, under Stalin's 1925 leadership, Frunze and Voroshilov's roles were official. Trotsky was completely out of military affairs and no longer war commissar. Frunze was the new war commissar, and Voroshilov his chief commander and vice commissar. Trotsky's Politburo exit October 1926. After his January 25 military affairs demotion, Trotsky refused other assignments and sulked. Accordingly, under the no-nonsense Stalinist regime, Trotsky's many Politburo enemies demanded Trotsky's ouster from the Politburo on disciplinary grounds. This finally happened at the October 1926 15th Party Conference. In October 1926, Stalin supported the ouster of Trotsky from the Politburo, while opposing simultaneously Zinoviev and Kamenev's motion that Trotsky be expelled from the party altogether. There would be no Lenin for protection now. Only Stalin's intervention had saved Trotsky from expulsion at this point. Thus, in 1926, Trotsky lost his position in the highest leadership of the party. He was out of their political decision-making, where, after all, he had alienated almost all of its members and had, at the end of the conference, barely held on to his party membership. The hatred the party had for Trotsky on the eve of the Kronstadt Rebellion, where it had been set aside momentarily, now came back to roost. Again, only by the skin of his teeth had Trotsky escaped expulsion from the party altogether, and that, ironically, only because of Stalin's intervention. Trotsky out of the Central Committee, October 1927. In October 1927, Trotsky's reprieve failed to save him when he refused to change his ways. In October 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the Central Committee altogether for factionalism. This date marks the official end of him as the leader of the CPSU. Trotsky was gone in January of 1928. In November 1927, at the 15th Congress, Trotsky was expelled from the party altogether. The Politburo and the Central Committee ordered Trotsky to cease and desist in the organization of subversive activities and demonstrations, and they ordered him exiled to Soviet Turkestan. Trotsky begins his long journey in exile, February 1929. Finally, unsatisfied that Trotsky would cease and desist while on Soviet soil, the Politburo and Central Committee ordered him expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929. He was taken to a resort island named Buyakada, that is the Big Island, largest of the 9 Princess Islands, then called Principe Island, near Istanbul, and handed $1,500 in severance by the head of his Cheka escort. Buyakada is 2 square miles in territory, and Trotsky spent 4 years there, 1929 to 1933. Trotsky disgraces himself in Mexico, January 1937 to August 1940. After several years at Principe Island, Trotsky lived in and traveled through Europe. He finally took refuge in Mexico City in 1937 as the guest of Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas and former Mexican communist, the muralist, now Trotskyist, Diego Rivera, at the latter's home in Coyoacán. Trotsky would spend nearly 4 years in this Mexico City suburb, the last 4 years of his life. In the home of his host, he had a sexual affair with Frida Kahlo, Rivera's wife, and subsequently was forced by his own misbehavior into a far less secure Coyoacán home owned by Miss Kahlo. When President Cárdenas learned of the real reason for the Rivera-Trotsky falling out, he was disgusted and removed his force of bodyguards. This left Trotsky to handle his own security using Minneapolis Teamsters, who proved inadequate. On August 20th of 1940, at this home of Frida Kahlo in Coyoacán, Trotsky was eventually assassinated, attacked with an ice pick to the skull. He died the next day, killed by one of Stalin's finest, Ramon Mercader. This business with Miss Kahlo and the Trotsky assassination is pursued in the Salma Hayek produced movie Frida. The party never liked Trotsky and did not want him in the summer of 1917. Lenin wanted him, despite their many years of mutual antipathy, and in a leadership position for his own reasons, as we have seen. In early 1918, Lenin moved Trotsky from the Foreign Office to being chief of the War Commissariat. Why? Because Lenin appreciated Trotsky's no-nonsense, absolute discipline, take charge and get it done attitude. However, it's also true that Trotsky, in the opinion of many of his contemporaries, did not do well at all in the Civil War. There was constant conflict between Trotsky and Stalin over every aspect of military operations, and this continued throughout 1918. One reason was Trotsky's advocacy of using former Tsarist officers in huge numbers. Trotsky recruited well over 75,000 of them, as this would be a 5.5 million man army, and Trotsky felt he had no choice. Nevertheless, it was one of the major reasons for his being disliked by the old Bolsheviks and the new working class officers during the Civil War. Also, the Stalinists did not believe the political officer equivalence for each Tsarist officer was sufficient until Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Cheka, began the wholesale introduction of Chekas as political officers. In April 1919, Stalin and Dzerzhinsky were able to replace Trotsky's chief of staff with Frunze, who took Vatsita's place, and 3 of the remaining 4 seats went to Stalinists. Therefore, in the 5-man party war committee, this left Trotsky as war commissar and 4 Stalinists. Another more justifiable criticism about Trotsky's arrogant ruling class personal behavior, especially toward the working class officers of the Red Army, something Trotsky tends to admit in his biography, My Life. When Lenin's protection was withdrawn by death, it was only a matter of time until Trotsky disappeared from the scene. As I say it, if it had not been Stalin who confronted him, it would have been someone else, and I'm rather sure the result would have been the same for the reasons we have discussed in this series of books. And I might just mention that at Netflix right now, there's a movie about the Trotsky assassination called The Chosen, I believe, which might be of interest to you. At any rate, that concludes Lecture 23A, and next time we're going to move on to 23B, and or 123B, I should say.